Hello, everyone, and welcome to NACTO's public webinar series and the Near Miss Project webinar with Dr. Rachel Aldred. My name is Kate Sillinger. I'm the Strategy Director here at NACTO, and I'm going to be moderating today. I'm just going to do some of the quick logistics first just to get them out of the way. We're planning to leave about 20 minutes at the end for questions. There is a question box on your on-screen control panel, so as you think of questions, just go ahead and type them in there, and we will be answering them at the end. And then just so you know, NACTO is going to be hosting webinars like these on an ongoing basis, so please feel free to check out our website at www.nacto.org. For those of you who are new to NACTO, we are the National Association of City Transportation Officials. We represent and connect the transportation departments in over 50 cities around the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And our goal is to build cities as places for people with safe, sustainable, accessible, and equitable transportation choices that can support a strong economy and a vibrant quality of life. And we do this largely through knowledge transfer, bringing together city transportation departments to learn from each other, helping cities to develop city-focused design standards that meet urban needs and conditions, and also through events like this webinar, providing a platform for leading voices and for new voices alike in transportation. Our presenter today is Dr. Rachel Aldred. Dr. Aldred is a reader in transport at the University of Westminster and one of the UK's preeminent cycling researchers. Her work includes the near miss work we're about to hear about, research on reporting trends in local media, modeling for propensity to bike, analyses of how infrastructure can help normalize cycling, and studies around cycling in children and cycling in culture. Her methods include surveys, mathematical modeling, evidence reviews, secondary analysis of qualitative and quantitative data, all looking at what encourages people to bike and what we can do to make it easier and safer. In addition to Dr. Aldred's exceptional credentials, what we at NACTO like best about her work is her real focus on applicability and developing research questions and data that cities and practitioners can directly use to make cities safer and better for people cycling. NACTO's work is to make city streets safer for people biking and walking and taking transit. Dr. Aldred's work provides an empirical case for what we should do and shines a light on where we should be going. And we're really thrilled to have her with us here today. So, without further ado, Dr. Rachel Aldred.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you to NACTO, fantastic organisation, for hosting this. And I'm really looking forward to getting the opportunity to talk about this and also to answer the questions that come up. I think I'm going to talk for about half an hour, so yeah, that should leave 20 minutes or so for questions. First of all, I'm going to say something about why near misses matter, why I first got into the area of near misses a few years ago, and give the Near Miss Project as an example, talk about the approach I've followed and the impact it's had on policy and practice, but also cover other approaches to monitoring and researching near misses, because this is just one approach. I think there are other approaches that I would be following potentially in the future or that I think are particularly promising, and some considerations for city planners in deciding on an approach. Hopefully, my talk will help convince you that looking at near misses is important, interesting and useful. So how should you do it? What should you think about? So why do near misses matter? There were initially three reasons, I think, why I started looking into near misses in 2014. Firstly, because potentially they can predict collision risk situations or even specific locations, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. Secondly, my background is qualitative sociology, I guess, is the list of different methodologies that I've been involved in might have hinted at. That my background is doing qualitative research and understanding culture and experiences. So I was also interested in understanding road culture in the UK in this context and how it affected people's cycling experiences, getting those stories as well as the numbers, and also clarifying the relationship between perceived and objective risk. There's one, anyone who researches cycling could tell you that there's an apparent gap between people saying that cycling is terrifying and the objective numbers, which say that, as a cyclist, even somewhere like the UK, which is more dangerous than it should be, you're very unlikely to die on your bike. But people think it's terrifying. So for me, near misses, I thought, were one of the things in between those two. They will potentially help to explain people's feelings about cycling. And it also, I think, chimes with a more proactive approach to road safety, which organisations like NACTO have championed. it seemed to me that the approach we take to road safety is really at odds with the approach we take to rail and air safety when near misses are seen as really important. Also, workplace safety. Workplace, I mean, my workplace, I'm sure many others, if I have a near miss at work, I'm meant to record this. Something is meant to happen. But we don't seem to see the roads in the same way, even though roads are actually a workplace for many people. And I think, to me, the rise of Vision Zero implies that this traditional approach that we follow in the UK and many places is not good enough, that we need to act before deaths and serious injuries, not after. But very often what happens here is that, you know, if you have a cluster of serious injuries, a death, then something may happen, but we don't do things before. Also, it seems to me we've got increasing evidence about what works, what we need to do in terms of engineering, enforcement, education, and so on, like Kay Teschke's excellent work on infrastructure and cycle injuries. So increasingly we have ideas about what to do about cycling risk, pedestrian risk, and so on. But we need to know where to intervene. And as I was saying, I think we should do that proactively. We should intervene before these things happen. Also, in many contexts like the UK and London, we have high mode share targets for cycling. We don't have that much cycling, but we want more of it. And that suggests that we need to look at those places that currently don't have large numbers of deaths and serious injuries and make those safe in advance of mode share growing. Otherwise, those places may actually be particularly dangerous, but because there aren't many people cycling, we don't actually know. And I just wanted to give you an example, so in London, there's often a great deal of focus on central London, where large numbers of cycling deaths and serious injuries happen. But when I did some analysis, normalising, controlling for cycling volumes, what actually became apparent was that many of the outer London boroughs, you know, per unit of cycling, seem much more dangerous than some central and inner London boroughs, but they don't get any attention because hardly anyone is cycling. But actually, potentially, some of the junctions, some of the locations in those boroughs may be more lethal than in central London. So, you know, knowing about near misses, knowing about what's underneath the tip of the iceberg could be really important for fixing these things before we start to see large numbers of deaths and serious injuries. So, the Near Miss Project, I'll just say something about the approach and the findings before moving on to what I think might be some of the implications for policy and practice and what you might be doing. So the key aim of the Near Miss Project back in 2014, when I was thinking about this project, was really establishing near miss rates. Nobody, it seemed, had done a study of cycling near misses and sort of said how many of these happen, you know, what is the rate per kilometre, per person or whatever, how frequent are these things? And yet talking to people who cycle anecdotally gave the sense that potentially there were a lot of these incidents out there. So I wanted to get a rate, how frequent were near misses in the UK primarily. And I also had some sub-objectives. So firstly, I wanted to classify near misses. I wanted to find out if we could put them into categories, similar to what we might do with injury collisions, and then sort of say, well, how do we deal with these different types of incident? I wanted to look at any variations in near miss rates and to see, did some people, perhaps some locations, were the places, people, whatever, that had higher rates of near misses than others. I wanted to analyse perceptions of causes. What did people think had caused a near miss, and what did they think might have prevented it? So I was interested in how cyclists felt about near misses they were involved in, and also to look at different categories of near miss. And this will come up in a minute, but it struck me that all near misses were not equal. So just like you have different severity of injury, I thought there were likely to be different categories, you know, different grades of near miss. So what made a near miss appear more problematic? So this was in the context, I would say the research field was very new at this point. So these were kind of objectives that you might develop in the context of a new research field. And it also led to the specific design that I developed. So the research was funded by the Creative Exchange and Blaze. I got a small grant to carry out the research in year 1 and year 2. And developed this idea of the one-day diary. So the idea that people would sign up for one day to keep, they signed up in advance for a specific day, and they would keep a record of any cycle trips and any incidents that they experienced. So one reason why I did that was to minimise the burden on respondents, so that people were they were just writing about one specific day, and also in the hope that they would be able to remember reasonably well what happened on that day. They reported it generally the same day or the next day. Also, I was concentrating on generalization, not geography. I was trying to set out, establish the field. I wasn't trying to say this particular junction is more dangerous than that particular junction. I was trying to do more generalization than that. And I'll come back to this because maybe, there's other approaches now that the field is more developed. So just a few headlines. So it was autumn 2014 and autumn 2015 that I carried out the project, and people located any incidents that happened, they located on a map and they answered questions about them. So even though I said I tried to minimize respondent burden, for some people who had quite a lot of incidents, this did take some time, the questionnaire, to fill in, and I was relieved I'd only asked for one day. And we had 2,500 UK participants over both years and recording over 6,000 incidents between them. So there were a lot of incidents, there were quite a lot of people. And certainly the data, particularly in the first year, was very detailed. There was a lot of qualitative detail that we had to analyse and categorise. And yeah, as I said, I think this is the first study to estimate a national near-miss incident rate that we can then compare with minor and serious injury risks, which I'll get onto in a moment. So just quickly about the sample. So who did we have? Well, largely it was experienced cyclists. It was demographically skewed. It was demographically skewed in the way that cycling in this country is demographically skewed. They tended to be male. They tended to be in sort of early to middle age. 30% lived in London, partly because we got a lot of press coverage in London. More people signed up. And there were basically two groups of people. There were weekday commuters or other utility cyclists, or a smaller group were people who were doing leisure rides at the weekend. And obviously that's a bit oversimplified, but those were the two key groups we had. And most of them were experienced long-term cyclists. So in year 2, when I asked about how long people had been cycling for, I was quite staggered that virtually everyone had been cycling for quite a long time. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But this is people who are used to the kind of cycling conditions that we have in the UK, I think it's worth saying. So what kind of incidents were people reporting? And one thing that really struck me in the first year, going through and coding all these thousands of individual descriptions of incidents, was that actually they did fall into categories. Sometimes when I've worked with qualitative data, sometimes you really can't do that, but this time we could. So there were, for instance, a big chunk of incidents where someone's way was blocked. It could be a parked car, could be an obstacle, could be someone stepping out. So that was the largest single group. Following that was a problematic pass, which was generally a close pass, somebody overtaking too closely, generally a motorist. Occasionally another cyclist, generally a motorist. Next, we had vehicle pulls in or out. Now, the classic one for this is somebody cycling along a major road and a motorist pulls out of a minor road without looking, and the cyclist often has to swerve to avoid them. Also quite common types of incident. And many of these, not all of them, but many of them, when you look at the collision statistics and how they're categorized, you do see some similarities. There were also people driving at a cyclist, which could be in a parked up residential area, classically somebody driving straight at the cyclist in the assumption the cyclist will get off the road, get out of their way, or perhaps on a rural lane, a narrow rural road where the cyclist is forced off onto the verge. Other less common incident types included near left and right hook, which I'll say something about in a bit, but also those are very strongly represented, particularly in places like London, in cyclist serious injuries and deaths. So there's those. And there's also tailgating and near dooring. So there's a whole spectrum of incidents. Some of them clearly seem more serious than others, and indeed that proved to be the case. Incident scariness. Now, we asked people about how frightening and how annoying the incidents were. And this, I think, helps us think about what to prioritize. So, I can imagine a transport system where people are not frightened, certainly where they don't find incidents very scary. But it's hard to imagine that a transport system would never annoy anyone. So, in my view, scariness is something that one should prioritise over annoyance. But still, if you're trying to encourage people to cycle or indeed walk, use public transport, and so on, then not regularly annoying them is also probably a good idea. So there's different levels of incident potentially. So one thing that I noticed was that when we looked at how scary people thought the various incidents were, it seemed often to correlate reasonably well with how dangerous one might think these incidents might be. So a near dooring at the top there, these are not that common incidents, but they are incidents that do show up quite strongly in UK urban areas in terms of deaths and very serious injuries, because basically a passenger opens a car door often, a cyclist is knocked off, and a motor vehicle behind just runs them over, and the results are often very, very serious. So people often seemed, I think, to display quite a strong awareness of what type of incident was more likely to pose a higher risk to them than others. Similarly, close passes and left and right hooks, pulling in or out, those appear quite strongly also, those kind of things, as contributory factors. One thing it's maybe worth pointing out is it's pedestrian behaviour was generally not seen as frightening as motorist behaviour. So pedestrians stepping out were generally not seen as particularly frightening or annoying, which I think is interesting. It was the interactions with motorists rather than pedestrians or other cyclists even that tended to lead to these kind of reactions. Incident rates, as I was saying, I thought it was quite important to look at how frequently these kinds of incidents happened and to compare it with injuries as well. So this is daily incident rates for men and for women. And one thing first to mention is that generally women were experiencing higher daily incident rates than men. This is, it's not a huge difference, but it is statistically significant. And also the other thing to notice here is that this is quite a lot of incidents. This is an average of between 2 and 2.5 incidents on a day's cycling. Also, the level of incidents seemed relatively stable generally. So, for instance, you can see below, there was no evidence that the incident rate was associated with the local prevalence of cycling. So I guess there was a hope or an idea maybe that places with more cycling would have lower incident rates, but that didn't actually seem to be the case. This figure was published in the first paper from the project, and this just compares injury and non-injury incident rates, and it does illustrate the extent to which near misses might be seen as this kind of the injuries might be the tip of the iceberg, and the near misses are really potentially much more numerous. So the top figure is a figure that I remember hearing I think the former cycling commissioner in London say that a regular UK commuting cyclist might expect to die once every 8,000 years or something like that. That kind of magnitude. These figures, by the way, the first 4 I've calculated from the literature, but it's that kind of magnitude. So that sounds quite good. I mean, none of us would expect to live to 8,000, and even a reported serious injury, maybe once every 400 years. A reported slight injury or any injury, we're maybe looking at once every 67 or once every 20 years. So even a very slight injury doesn't happen very often for a regular UK cyclist, even though we know that it's not as safe as it should be, as it is in the Netherlands, for instance. However, when I looked at how frequent some of these near-miss incidents were, then they are very much more frequent, as you can guess from the graph I just presented. So maybe the most illustrative one is the very scary incident, perhaps, because that's saying that your regular UK commuting cyclist is perhaps experiencing a very scary incident on around a weekly basis, and that shocked me really, because a very scary incident is something that might have quite a profound impact on people. And people being harassed or abused, which was coded based on the description of incidents, that might happen potentially once every few weeks. So there's quite a lot of quite scary stuff going on, even though the injury statistics, don't look so bad, perhaps. One other thing that, well, a couple of other things actually that were quite worrying in terms of who was experiencing incidents. So in the UK, as in the USA, there's a big push to diversify cycling, which is really important. We have, 3/4 of our cyclists are male. We have predominantly younger adults. We have predominantly able-bodied adults, and so we don't have the variety of cyclists that we should have, given how accessible cycling can potentially be. And one of the things that was quite worrying was that people who were cycling more slowly were experiencing more incidents. So the kind of people, the under 8 miles an hour people who were pootling along, were experiencing, it seemed like, an environment that felt much more hostile than people who were cycling at 12 plus miles an hour. In the second year, when we asked about cycling experience, so we separated out the people who've been cycling for under 2 years, and this was literally 41 people. As I say, the data set was predominantly experienced cyclists. However, even with those low numbers, we found a statistically significant difference. So these new cyclists were experiencing substantially more incidents, and in particular, they were experiencing double the rate of very scary incidents compared to people who've been cycling over 2 years. So this, again, is of great concern. We know, for instance, in London, that we have this massive rate of turnover among cyclists, but we don't really quite know why that is, and potentially this could be part of the explanation, I think. I only really have time to sort of nod to this here, but the impacts on people's future cycling, a lot of the data, I mean, the numbers are quite shocking, but also the descriptions, the stories I found really, really sad often reading a lot of these, looking through them, coding them and so on. So a lot of people, there was a sense that people, to be able to cycle in the UK, that you had to be on constant alert. So people were asked what they would do in response to the incidents, and often there was this kind of resignation. I am already cautious. I can only attempt to be even more cautious. So kind of sense that it wasn't going to be possible to prevent these incidents. And one thing we know about risks as well is that if people perceive risks to be inequitable and they think they have no control over these risks or little control, they are not willing to take on the risk. So, we know that this is liable to be off-putting, this kind of thing, because people feel they have no control and they feel that it's unfair. What can they do? The second quote really stuck in my mind. To stay alive, one must also anticipate that all others will be careless, which kind of maybe gives you an insight into the fact that in the UK, our levels of child cycling are super low. If that is the general sort of feeling, you have to anticipate that everybody else will be careless towards you. And finally, people sort of saying that they lack confidence, they feel nervous, and a bit of an insight as well. Tailgating was, often seen as particularly frightening, and people, that sense that there's a vehicle behind you, there's someone behind you who doesn't care about you, maybe who's going to be careless, and what can you do? Really, really hard actually to do anything. And people talked about the strategies, cycling in the middle of the lane, getting out of the way, and the feeling that they had that many of those, there really wasn't any way they could definitely prevent these things themselves. Just final comment on the data really is that we also asked people about what kind of things might prevent incidents. And one thing that was interesting actually was that in one of the second paper I submitted, I think had a comment from the peer reviewer that, well, no wonder the cyclists think they're not to blame, that's their perspective, which is kind of fair enough. And I nearly said, yes, this is a cyclist perspective, but it's still valid. And I thought, hang on, let's have a look. And I went to have a look at police injury data. And the police in this country actually will record contributory factors. So you can get some kind of a measure of who the police think is to blame for different incidents. And actually, it also seemed to be the case that certainly for adult cyclists, the police also tended to think cyclists weren't to blame. So, maybe that was to some extent a reflection of what was happening, but although it also is, of course, the cyclist's perspective. Anyway, the cyclists were asked to suggest things, changes in driver behaviour, changes in infrastructure, changes in their own behaviour that they thought might have prevented an incident. And just the point I'm making here, I guess, is that for those slower cyclists who are experiencing more incidents, more frightening incidents, they are particularly likely to say they want to be protected from motor traffic. But, it's quite popular with everyone. I wanted to say something about, in the final sort of 5 or 10 minutes, some responses that we've seen in the UK to this, and then some considerations how you might develop, how these ideas could be developed going forward. And I certainly, want to continue to be involved in near-miss research myself, so there's some things I've been thinking about as well. So just one response has been that this is guidance from London, that increasingly subjective safety, the feelings that people have, the things that they find intimidating are actually included in design guidance as something to avoid. So you can see on the left, feeling of safety. It's not just collision risk, it's also feeling of safety and potentially near-miss incidents, non-injury incidents. So I think that's quite important. Secondly, another response that has been happening in relation to near-miss research and debates around near-misses has been around enforcement. So a number of police services in the UK are lecturing people with giant mats, as you see on the right, basically using undercover officers on bikes to then stop drivers and educate them about how much space they ought to be giving a cyclist. A third type of response, or kind of straddles enforcement and planning, I think. So you've got also police services encouraging cyclists and other road users to report near misses and to report dangerous driving and so on. And it's interesting that sometimes that is used for enforcement. So the Metropolitan Police have sent letters to employers in particular where people were using company vehicles, but also potentially used for planning as well, or to plan enforcement. So if there's a junction, to do some general enforcement around that junction, or to give to Transport for London or to give to other local planning authorities so that they can do something in terms of engineering. Because often if an intersection has a lot of near misses, then often there will be an engineering solution. There will be something you can do to make that junction safer. So just to get to the final section, so the approaches to collecting near-miss data. So this is something I've been thinking about in terms of the use, authorities using it in terms of future research and so on. So there's other approaches to collecting this kind of data that are also time limited. So I was recently in the Velo City conference in the Netherlands, and one thing they have in the Netherlands is something, a Dutch bicycle week, I forget the Dutch term, but basically where they encourage an awful lot of cyclists to collect GPS data and to submit that, and it can then be used for planning. I think potentially it does also include information on experiences and so on. It's not specifically a near-miss approach, but it's quite interesting because they also thought, okay, let's have a particular window where people contribute to this research, and then hopefully we might avoid too much drop-off. We'll have everybody knows it's the bicycle week and people are doing this. Another question is around subjective or objective data. So my near-miss data was subjective. People said, I have experienced a near-miss, I've experienced an incident. But of course, potentially, you could collect more objective data. You could have instrumented bikes. You could record how close motor vehicles and so on pass to cyclists. And that potentially can reduce burden on respondents and maybe seen as more reliable because it's objective data. What was interesting was that when I did a comparison, I found fairly similar rates. So, it seemed that when people said I had a close pass, then this correlated reasonably well with measuring, 50 centimetres or whatever close pass distance. There's also the question about how much do you want to capture? Because objective data is potentially good for close passes, but it's not so good for some of these other incident types, which are quite hard to detect automatically and record. There's also, of course, a question about who collects the data, particularly where it's being used in city planning, enforcement, and so on. Should it be police services? Should it be authorities? Should it be academics, private sector, or advocacy organisations? So I think there are pros and cons with all of those things. There are issues around data management. There are often ethical issues, issues around the reuse of data, but also issues of credibility and trust, and of motivation. People are already over-surveyed often, and people need to feel that there's a reason for them, particularly if they're being asked to complete quite a long and onerous survey, or even to record data repeatedly over a long time period. They need to be motivated to do that, and often that is by thinking that this is going to improve things for cycling. Approaches to collecting near-miss data, some other examples as well. So one of the exciting things actually about being in this area has been really quite a flourishing of different ideas, approaches, gadgets, and so on. So I think it's a really exciting time to be researching near misses. So another example, open web reporting platforms. So there's an example on the right, which was one of the relatively early ones in the UK, Kaleidoscope. There are other ones where basically you have an open platform and you encourage people to report an incident. So there are questions about how open it is in terms of whether people register. Do you know who is replying? Do you focus only on near misses, or do you also ask people to report other things that they think are problematic, and so on? So potentially you can collect a lot of data there, but there's questions about focus and questions on representativeness potentially as well. Using apps or using gadgets, there's been some quite interesting examples in London, for example. Those two examples there could be used to, rather than an internet platform, to record near miss data. And also what I think is quite exciting is that this potentially allows collecting route data. It doesn't necessarily always do so, but potentially you can collect data on the routes that people followed as well as near misses they experienced. I'll say something about that in a moment, but another thing about apps on your phone, gadgets and so on, is that often there's real-time reporting. You can, for instance, press a button to indicate a near miss or a problem location. So potentially that's even more reliable than asking people at the end of the day, although there's possibly then an issue about risk related to somebody pressing a button at the same time as something unpleasant is happening to them. But there's all these approaches have pluses and minuses, and I think we'll see the development of many of these over the coming years. Route data. I did want to say something about route data. So without some measure of how exposed people are to different cycling environments, locations, and so on, we can't say one intersection is riskier than another. Or we run into the same problem we have, say, in central London, where you have one junction with 70 injuries. In outer London, you have junctions with 1 or 2 injuries, but actually there's a fraction of the amount of cycling. So you need to know where people are cycling in order to normalise by the amount of cycling. So for the near miss project, for me, I didn't collect route data in that project. My aims were different. I wasn't attempting to do that. But in future, I think it's a very good idea to collect route data. I'm doing some work at the moment with injuries, where I'm looking at injury risk in relation to routes, in relation to exposure to different types of infrastructure. And I would certainly think, if you're thinking about doing near miss research, monitoring and so on, to consider it. Because like injury data, near miss data is skewed to where people currently cycle. That's the problem, and that is a problem that you hear about the places where people are cycling. You don't necessarily hear about the places that are so terrifying that nobody cycles there. But also for near misses, for injury data, you've got the injury data set, but for near misses, you're going to have more reporting bias. So actually controlling for exposure becomes more important. Or you might just get, okay, these junctions look really bad, but that's where our group of people who are using our platform happen to be cycling. So on the other hand, of course, collecting route data involves more privacy issues and also complicates the analysis. Just to conclude with a couple of things to consider that I thought people might want to think about if you're thinking about taking near miss research forward. Participant motivations I mentioned, but it's such an important one. You can have very high drop-off rates if you leave something open, if people don't feel it's going to have any comeback, if people feel, okay, I'll report these bad experiences, but nothing ever happens. And the trouble is that can then have a negative impact. It looks like things are not happening, but it's just that people don't have an incentive to report. Reaching a broad spread of participants, very important. If we're seeking to draw geographical conclusions, we don't just want people doing one type of cycling. If we're really interested in locations, also generalizing. We don't, if we want to generalize, we don't just want one group of cyclists. And as I mentioned, the privacy, ethical and safety issues. So there's quite a few kind of ethics board type issues with this kind of research. So, but really, as I say to my dissertation students, we think about what are your key questions and goals. What do you really want to learn about? Do you want to pinpoint specific sites? Or do you want to learn about factors associated with near-miss risk? So, are roundabouts more dangerous in terms of near misses than crossroads? What do you want to do? Are you interested in the geography? Do you want to implement engineering-based responses, enforcement, or education? So that will shape the kind of information you collect. Do you want to change the media and policy debate around road safety? And actually, I think near-miss, mine and others' near-miss research has started to help do that in the UK. But is that an explicit goal? Do you want to engage more with cyclists? Do you want to get them more contributing to design suggestions for areas to improve? Is there a particular incident type that you're interested in? Close passes, tailgating, and so on. So a whole load of questions. What are you really interested in? What is the most important thing? What action do you want to follow? And those things, and also equally important factors like budget and analytical capacity, should determine the approach, who does what, the type of data you collect, and so on. So I think, as I was suggesting, I think the near-miss project, I hope, was quite valuable research, but I would probably move on and think about route data and think about some of these other issues more explicitly, having had that experience. So I think that's it for my bit. So I think there's plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So yeah, look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Rachel. That was fantastic. We've got a ton of questions coming in. So I think we're just going to start off. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about near misses and sort of the relationship between new cyclists and experienced cyclists. Sort of why do new cyclists have more near misses, and sort of what the role that you're seeing experience playing in these incidents.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I mean, I guess you could see the new cyclist finding in different ways. I mean, you could hopefully think that maybe the new cyclists will become more skilled, I don't know, get more used to incidents, and then they will also become likely experienced cyclists. Or more pessimistically, you could think, well, maybe many of these people are just so put off that they're going to stop. I mean, I think it's probably a mixture of things. I mean, one thing might be around the subjective, the fact that a similar incident potentially might affect a new cyclist differently from an experienced cyclist. But I think that subjective is really important, particularly given that we're trying to get underrepresented groups. We're trying to get people who are put off cycling to cycle. So yeah, some of it is possibly, some of it's subjective, some of it objective, but it's something that I think is a real big concern.
Cool. One of the questions we're getting is, did you observe, or were you able to look for any locational patterns with the incidents? For example, did you see any the incidents more concentrated at intersections or other portions of the road infrastructure, or was the sort of analysis that you did not looking for that?
I was asked about that. I got quite a lot of planners in the UK asking me about that as well, and I was really quite wary, because the problem was, in looking at any specific intersection, then I just didn't have enough. But in terms of categorizing locations and so on, I didn't have the route data. So the worry was that I would just, all I might be able to say was, okay, this proportion of incidents took place at intersections, which I did, but that didn't then tell you that much unless you know where the people are cycling. If you know what proportion of their journey took place on a bus lane, then you might be able to draw some conclusions about bus lanes. But without that, you can't. And I'm now doing some analysis of cycling injury data where I can do that, and the results are really interesting. But without data on the full routes that people were following, I would really be nervous to do that, because you just risk reproducing where people are riding, and saying, okay, this type of road is dangerous, but that's actually just the fact that you have more people riding there.
Great. A question that's coming in is sort of related to that. From what you've done, are you seeing any suggestions of what specific design solutions cyclists would like to see? And then related off of that, do you know of any good examples of design changes that have really changed the safety outcome?
Yes. I mean, the big thing so there were two. I think the slide was the separation and repairs. So basically, these were when people were asked, and people couldn't always think of infrastructural changes or whatever, or anything that could have prevented an incident. Why should they? In a sense, people are not engineers generally in the survey, but people talked about repairs to the road environment or to paths. One problem that we have certainly in the UK, is that often cycle paths, cycle infrastructure and so on are poorly maintained, they're not necessarily swept, there'll be rubbish. So there are a whole load of suggestions along those lines, but even more popular with suggestions about being separated from motor traffic through protected bike lanes and so on, and at intersections and along links. And I think that the sort of infrastructure that we're starting to see built in London and some other UK cities, it really is the kind of thing that people were talking about. They would say, you know, not paint, please. We would actually like to be separated from motor traffic. And I think the research that's been done on injury risk by people like Kate Eschke has suggested that hopefully those kind of solutions will also be safer in terms of injuries, but you know, perhaps just as important, that people won't have these regular frightening experiences that may lead people to stop cycling, which is obviously a very healthy form of transport. So you know, we need people to keep cycling.
Excellent. And there's one actually thing that I will toss into that question from NACTO's perspective is that NACTO's actually done a substantial body of research looking at the relationship between increases in cycling and increases in infrastructure and the reduction in what we call KSI, killed or severely injured. It's not near miss, but close, as a result of those increases in cycling and infrastructure. So that information is available on NACTO's website, which is www.nacto.org. And then I would also, if you're looking for this type of information, I would encourage folks to check out the New York City DOT website, because they've done a pretty intensive before and after look at their parking protected bike lane infrastructure and what that's done in terms of safety. A next question that we've got from the audience is, do you have thoughts or suggestions about measuring cyclist volumes? It's something that a lot of cities have trouble doing. It's not the easiest thing to measure. But clearly some of the sort of exposure portion of near miss is related to that. So just sort of what your thinking is on that topic.
It's so important, and it is really a struggle. I mean, how I would, for future near miss research, I would get that data about routes that people followed and use that. Currently I'm doing some injury research for London, and the great thing about London is that Transport for London has developed, it's called Cinnamon, cycle network model, something like that. I'm not exactly sure the acronym, but basically it is a cycling model, and it seeks to route people, cyclists, where they think they actually go. So I'm actually able to use that model to control for exposure when I'm looking at injury data, and it's literally, I'm writing the paper now and talking to stakeholders about it, but that seems like a really promising approach. Another idea I have is that if we knew where people were starting their journey and we knew where they were injured or had a near miss, even without the route data, you might be able to use an algorithm to route them, and that might be good enough. So I'm trying to, this is all stuff that I'm planning, because I think we really need to be able to do this, but often the data is limited.
Cool. And related, I guess, then to that question, we're getting some questions about reporting and how, if you have sort of thoughts about what cities or advocates can do to help people report more of these incidents, potentially in addition to working with you.
Well, I think there was one really strong advantage of it being led by cities or some form of officialdom, is that it can then be sort of directly used to intervene, and it potentially, if people then do see changes happening, then that can be quite a motivator. If people, traditionally in this country, one cyclist organisation had an app called Fill That Hole, which was about sorting out potholes, and people were motivated to report to that because they then saw the potholes get fixed. So I think having that direct link is quite important. I think I probably have some ideas about sort of, the better ways to do it. Certainly, the Met Police has massively improved their reporting app, and it's now much more, the data they collect is much more structured, and they have location, the location data is better. So you need to have something that produces data that can be easily analysed. There's a whole load of issues about ethics and so on in relation to that. But as I said at the end, I mean, and I'm really happy to talk to people about this offline, is that it depends what you want it for and what what specific purposes are you aiming at making these engineering changes. What specifically do you want to do? Because there might be other things, in terms of thinking about engineering changes to junctions, you might actually just want to observe a junction and see what kind of problematic interactions take place. So what your focus is will determine how you do it. But as I said, I'm kind of quite keen on having route data to be able to look at exposure and look at risk in relation to where people are actually going. There's a whole range of different ways of doing it. It depends what the focus is.
Cool. One of the sort of data questions that's coming on is sort of what you're seeing or what you think could be done in relationship to the sort of data gathering and the sort of analysis and bike share, and sort of what's out there in terms of, is bike share data usable, and also do you find differences between people riding personal bikes and people using bike share cycle hire equipment?
That's an interesting question, because as we know that generally cycle hire bikes, and this is a surprise to many, tend to be safer than the use of personal bikes, and there's a range of explanations for that. I mean, I would say the people in my data set, I doubt I really had much in the way of people using cycle hire bikes. They're not really a substantial portion of mode share here. I mean, in London, they're only a really small proportion of bike trips. I think they're really important, but they're not very huge in terms of mode share. There would be interesting ways, I guess, of having near-miss reporting potentially built into a cycle hire scheme, and I can imagine how you might be able to do that. Possibly even some cycle hire schemes, I think, also do actually record where people go, whereas in London we just have the start and end point. But as I suggested, it might even be possible. You may well be able to use an algorithm to route people if you want to look at where they went in relation to the risk. So I think yeah, that is a really good idea. There is a lot of scope for potentially doing stuff with cycle hire data, but I didn't really have it in my data.
Two questions about sort of the data you have and sort of what you were able to do with it. Can you talk a little bit more about the gender breakdown and sort of how you saw that playing out in what you found?
The gender breakdown in terms of the incident rates? Correct. Yes. I mean, it was kind of, it was interesting. So the gender was also associated with speed, that women were tending to report slower speeds. So that's kind of, that's tied up with the speed issue as well, and also the need to diversify cycling. I mean, it seemed the perceptions of the incidents, I didn't have that much time, I didn't really have time to talk about the different types, whether different types of vehicle were involved in incidents. But when we sort of looked at that, when we did some modelling of that and the different types of things that made incidents more scary, people's perceptions seemed fairly consistent. It wasn't like there were women were all scared by one thing and men by another. It was pretty consistent, really. So I think it is tied up with the speed issue, and it's also something that, again, I think is with the new cyclists. It's if people are potentially more affected by a particular type of incident than some other people, I think that subjective thing really matters. I wouldn't see my response as being to try and convince that first group of people not to be so worried about it. We need to actually think about comfort. I think that's another, I guess, for me, an important thing about the near-miss project as well. It's about helping to reduce risk, but it's also about comfort. And I think we also maybe need to talk not just about people not being killed and injured on their bikes, but also having a really nice experience and feeling comfortable too.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Scariness feature, sort of how you measured it, what you told people, sort of what the methodology was around that? Scariness can mean different things to different people, so just a little bit more about how that worked and how people ranked it.
Yeah, it was basically just a 0 to 3 scale, really. So it was quite simple. It was just yeah, rate this on a scale of 0 to 3, where 0 is not at all scary and 3 is very scary. And what we were often then doing was looking at the 3 incidents. That's where people had really flagged up and said, this is very alarming. And it seemed that the patterns in terms of what incidents people identified, what involvement of, for instance, large vehicles associated with things being more frightening, and this maybe sounds quite obvious, but it did suggest that there were these patterns, and that one of the questions that came up more broadly is, are people actually reliable in terms of what they find frightening or what they think is dangerous. And it seemed like people were generally, you could see what they were responding to in terms of the risk in the situation, in terms of the other vehicles involved. And could I just say something actually in relation to a question I just noticed as well, which was around sampling, which was around sort of the bias in terms of the sampling, and that I thought was also quite an interesting and important question, because it is a convenient sample, the near miss project. We didn't have the budget to do anything larger or more complicated, so it is a convenient sample. But I think one thing that's quite interesting is that when we were able then to look at experience, then of course we found that most of our people were people who were long-term experienced cyclists and so on. But you know, if we could have had a more representative recruitment, we would have had a lot more incidents. So I think, if anything, we actually underestimated it because of the fact that we had these long-term experienced cyclists. And some of the comments that people made were really quite interesting in that regard. People talked about how they didn't really notice some of these things, or they sort of blocked them out, but having to record them made them think about them. And also that they, you know, they commented on how other people, newer cyclists, reacted to similar things. So it was, you know, it was a convenient sample, and it would have been lovely to have a more representative sample. But I think actually the way the bias worked out was not that problematic in a sense.
Excellent. One thing that I've been sort of thinking through as you've been talking, I'm curious how you sort of see the conversations around the near miss stuff that you've done, and this idea that you're seeing a huge number of near misses everywhere, and sort of how that relates to the bigger safety in numbers conversation. I mean, perhaps we're not at the volume of safety in numbers yet, but I'm just sort of curious, sort of philosophically, how you see those two related.
Yeah, I mean, because we didn't have data about routes, we were limited in terms of what we were going to be able to say about safety in numbers and near misses. I mean, it was a bit disappointing that when we looked at cycling prevalence at a local area, that's what we had. We didn't find that the places that had more cycling seemed to be, people seemed to be reporting lower near miss rates. That didn't seem to be the case, and so it's a bit disappointing. I mean, but maybe, as you say, maybe we're not at that threshold yet. In the UK, cycling is still very contested. It's still very low in a lot of places. So maybe we just haven't got there. Maybe we don't have the infrastructure to support those benefits being realised. Or maybe, more optimistically, it's possible that some incidents, some near misses experienced in higher cycling places might have been injuries somewhere else. So it's kind of, I wouldn't want to be too categorical about it, but I had expected potentially to find an effect related to cycling prevalence, and yeah, didn't.
Got it. I don't know if your data went into this, but did you see any difference between sort of larger and smaller vehicles, or transit vehicles versus a personal car? Just sort of, did that play into your findings at all? What people felt more comfortable around, or was it just a car is a car?
Well, certainly it seemed that the larger vehicles, so that would be predominantly a heavy goods vehicle or a bus, that was associated with incidents being more scary. And that, I mean, again, that totally makes sense, like many of other people's reactions. I mean, you have, we know that in many of our cities, particularly in central London, then there was a very high proportion of deaths and serious injuries that are caused by heavy goods vehicles. And serious injuries, actually, buses, there's quite a lot of bus serious injuries. So people, that made sense. I mean, people, as I think I mentioned earlier, people were much more tolerant of other pedestrians and cyclists, and that was interesting, because one of the lovely things about this project has been how interested people have been in it. And so I got a lot of feedback. One of the comments I've had a few times has been, well, actually it's other cyclists or pedestrians who are the greatest menace and so on. And it's looking at the data, it doesn't seem like that's the picture generally for the people that I had. They generally felt more sympathetic to other pedestrians. They didn't feel so threatened by the actions of other pedestrians and cyclists, and they had fewer of those incidents. Not to say that pedestrians and cyclists didn't cause problems, but predominantly it was drivers of motor vehicles who were experienced as causing more problems.
Got it. So we are almost out of time. I want to sort of end this by asking sort of a future-facing question. There's clearly your website, which is nearmiss.bike, www.nearmiss.bike, and I'm sort of curious what you're thinking, how you see yourself taking this research forward. Is there stuff you you want to be looking at as you move, as you do this again, if you do this again, and sort of what you're looking to do with this data. It seems to us incredibly valuable to cities everywhere as they go through and think about how they make their streets safer. And I just want to get a sense from you what folks on this call should take away from this, how they should contact you, what you're thinking.
Yes, I mean, definitely want to carry on being involved in this. I mean, especially since I'm actually doing more injury research at the moment, so the commonalities between how we might look at them are becoming quite apparent to me. I mean, the near miss project, as I think mentioned, was quite shaped by it being early in the field, it being a predominantly academic project. I mean, the policy impact it's had has been, I've been quite pleased with that, but it was predominantly aimed at academic knowledge in the first instance. So I think I didn't want to run it a third year. I thought, give it a break and let's think about how this could be taken forward. And I'm quite keen and interested, as I've been doing with some injury and other research, to be working with potentially cities and planners in thinking about how we can do this, that it can have that direct policy relevance, but also generate academic knowledge as well, because I think projects that could be really powerful, that could do both, and you could harness people were very enthusiastic about participating in the near miss project, but if you can harness it to city improvement and so on as well, and also generate knowledge, there's a lot we still don't know about near misses, and there's an awful lot of research still to be done. So I'm very interested in being involved in academic and policy work around near misses, and so please, people should feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to take those discussions forward.
Wonderful. I wish the webinar format had a way to give you a huge round of applause, because that was fantastic, and we're getting great, not so much questions, but now just feedback from folks saying that this was wonderful. So thank you so much for your time and helping us. And talking to everybody here today. For everyone on the line, if you are interested in conversations like this, I would highly encourage you to come check out the NACTO Designing Cities Conference, which will be in October in Chicago. I hope Rachel will be there, but even if she's not, we're going to have a whole variety of really spectacular, smart, engaged people who are really on the front lines of thinking about street safety and what we need to do to make our streets safer for people walking and biking and taking transit. And once again, thank you, Rachel. This was wonderful.
Thank you.